Hello and welcome to another episode of Ancient Warfare Answers. This is episode 159. Fabulous stuff. And I am Murray Dahm. I'm the assistant editor of Ancient Warfare magazine, and with me is the editor, Jasper Ortage. And he's going to be answering the question today from Alex Thrupp, who we're not sure is a patron, which just shows you that we'll answer whatever questions you ask, whether you send us an email or a message, or whether indeed you are a patron of us on Patreon. If you want to be a patron, then you can join us at www.patreon.com/Ancient Warfare Podcast, and there's 3 ways that you can support us there, even get a copy of the magazine. But today, Alex Thrupp's question is, what was the difference between Auxilia and Foederati? Yes.
Well, Murray, Foederati, of course, it's a term that we use specifically for allies of the Romans that were introduced sort of from the late 4th century, first by Theodosius I, and it's we've talked about them before. It's the various usually Germanic peoples who are enlisted as entire communities. Or as just the warriors first, or maybe a section of the warriors, to help bring the Roman army back up to strength after the defeat at Adrianople. But that's sometimes seen as this is a whole new thing. We're suddenly enlisting all these people who are not actually Romans. But of course, and we give them a new name. But of course, it really is not new at all. The Romans had almost, had by then been enlisting people for nearly 1,000 years. They'd had the Italian allies first in the Republican era, and then client kings who think of people like Massinissa in the Second Punic War, that they made a treaty with, and that's what foedus means. Foedus means it's a treaty. To fight with the Roman army. And in most cases, it's a treaty with the city or a treaty with the king, or in case of the Foederati, probably with tribal leaders. And in the middle, sort of between this Republican era and the late Roman Foederati, we have the Auxilia, who we tend to think of as different, but it's probably just it's sort of a difference in nuance. I mean, the client king situation, we tend to forget about them in the early empire, but there are certainly in the 1st century still various client kings who have various treaties with Rome, and whose sort of traces we can still see. There's a legion, 22nd Legion Deiotarana, is named after a legion that was provided to Rome by the Galatian king Deiotarus in the late 1st century BC, and it just becomes Romanized. And especially in the ancient Near Eastern area, there are various client kings for a while who will supply the army with entire units or detachments or things like that. And that is probably that is where this old situation of enlisting people into the army, first often for specialist type of troops, often cavalry, archers, slingers. The famous Cretan archers fight for Rome, Gallic cavalry, Germanic cavalry fighting for Caesar. Those allies become, in due course in the empire, become auxiliaries, and first they're often still we see names of early cohorts and ally that suggest that they were just raised again from a tribe as a whole, because the tribe the unit is named after a tribal leader. It's always funny that the Ala Indiana, which sounds to us as if it's something from India, is actually named after a chieftain called Indus. Later on, you get auxiliary units that are more named after, usually after a whole tribal, an ethnicity. The Batavians are, of course, very famous. You have all kinds of other tribal names for auxiliary units. And where it perhaps started as a treaty with the tribe as a whole, and it remains the case probably with the Batavians, but they're probably a special case. In other cases, it starts like a group, and then it becomes an individual contract, really, where soldiers enlist in an auxiliary unit themselves and sign up to serve for 26 years. And after that 26 years, they'll get certain rights, among them, of course, the right to Roman citizenship. So it sort of shifts from Roman treaties with a city, client, king, or a tribe to a more personal situation in the auxiliary units, where the units themselves become regular, and there are exceptions always, like numeri, where you have these regular units that, at least in theory, in the beginning, still recruit their new soldiers from tribes, but then recruit them one by one into the army, and those soldiers get Roman citizenship rights and the right to marry and stuff like that when they leave the army, and sometimes go back home, sometimes settle in the area where they've served. And of course, that advantage of the attraction of the citizenship that disappears in the early 3rd century after Caracalla introduces the universal Roman citizenship in AD 212. And then you get 3rd century, where the legions, on the other end, the legions come out entirely reformed, and the auxilia as a concept has disappeared. But the Roman idea of we can enlist other people to help us fill up the troop numbers that we need, that has never gone away. And then we just call them Foederati later. I think that's kind of how it works, Murray.
Yeah. I mean, the name Auxilia keeps going. Like there are units in the Notitia that are called Auxilia, but they're standard units. They're not the same differentiation that there's legions, Auxilia in the Notitia, but they are clearly just ways of referring to a unit's size and a unit's organisation, but they're not auxiliaries in the old-fashioned sense. And then you start to get this idea of Foederati, as you say, to sort of bump the numbers up, but it's a continuity of idea, just not terminology, which...
And again, some legal changes, I suppose.
And I think the idea of enlisting communities goes all the way back to deep, dark BC, in terms of enlisting a community, providing a number of mercenaries for a certain length of time. So it's always a fascinating, continuity often is much more interesting than change, even when it looks like change from the outside. So there we have it. So that's the difference between
sort of,
Auxilia and Foederati.